Calvin Deadeye Thompson, the veteran bounty hunter who now ran the town's gun shop, had watched her pour drinks one evening and swore there was something unsettling in her precision. "Way she moves," he told Marshal Walker over a glass of bourbon, "reminds me of the legendary markswomen I encountered during the border wars. Graceful as a dance, deadly as a rattler's strike." The regulars at the Silver Star Saloon never quite knew what to make of Lucy Blackwood. She moved through the rowdy establishment with an ease that seemed at odds with her delicate appearance, her honey-blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest lace cap, her blue calico dress always pressed, despite the dust that plagued their mountain town. She had a way of blending into the background, just another pretty face serving drinks to trail-weary cowboys and silver miners. They never noticed how her storm-grey eyes caught every detail, every subtle movement, every potential threat before it materialized. Old Jake Murphy, who'd owned the Silver Star for nearly 2 decades, had grown to appreciate Lucy's peculiar ways since she'd appeared 8 months ago. How she always positioned herself to keep both exits in view, how her dainty hands never trembled even when breaking up the roughest fights, how she moved with a fluid grace that seemed more suited to a shooting gallery than a saloon floor. The locals had taken to calling her Angel behind her back, though their tone carried equal parts admiration and unease. The town's children had developed their own fascination with the mysterious saloon girl. They'd made a game of trying to startle her, jumping out from behind water barrels or wagon wheels, but somehow Lucy always knew they were coming. Young Tommy Martinez swore he'd seen her practicing with a slingshot behind the saloon one morning, hitting tin cans so small they were barely visible in the dawn light. When questioned, she just smiled and said she used to entertain her younger siblings with such tricks. Miss Catherine Wells, who ran the town's small library, was among the few who'd managed more than passing conversations with Lucy. She'd been startled to discover the saloon girl could discuss complex mathematics and ballistic trajectories with surprising expertise, though Lucy always dismissed such knowledge as just a peculiar hobby. But there was something in the way she spoke about projectile motion and wind resistance that gave Catherine pause, as if she'd learned these principles not from books, but from hard-earned experience. The rougher elements who frequented the Silver Star had learned to treat Lucy with careful respect. Buck Hanson, a notorious troublemaker, still wouldn't talk about the night he'd tried to corner her in the storage room. All anyone knew was that he'd emerged white-faced and shaking, while Lucy had continued serving drinks as if nothing had happened. Some said they'd heard the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked, but no gun had ever been seen. Silver Pines. Mexican population had a particular reverence for Lucy, though few could explain exactly why. Doña Maria, the oldest resident of the town's Spanish Quarter, claimed she'd seen Lucy examining what looked like military maps of the border regions. When asked, Lucy had simply said she enjoyed studying geography, but Doña Maria had been married to a cavalry scout and recognized range cards when she saw them. As autumn winds swept down from the mountains, Lucy moved through the Silver Star. With practiced efficiency, each step deliberate, each movement precise, as if part of an elaborate choreography. She had a way of anticipating needs before they were voiced. A fresh drink appeared just as a glass emptied. A potential fight was diffused before tempers could flare. A lonely soul found a sympathetic ear at exactly the right moment. Old Jake had started keeping a journal about the changes in his saloon since Lucy's arrival. Like having a guardian angel with hidden steel, he'd written. Never seen anyone who could spot trouble so quick and stop it so quiet. Sometimes I think she's got eyes in the back of her head and the instincts of a gunfighter. Ain't natural, but I ain't complaining. The whispers about her past had grown more elaborate with time. Some said she'd been trained by a famous shooting instructor back east before some scandal forced her west. Others claimed she was connected to a mysterious group of female sharpshooters who performed in traveling shows. A few even suggested she was the sole survivor of a famous shootout in Texas, though nobody could quite explain how that led to her current profession. Perhaps the most intriguing rumors came from the stagecoach drivers who passed through town. They spoke of a series of remarkable shooting displays at various fairs across 3 states that had suddenly stopped 8 months ago, right when Lucy appeared in Silver Pine. The exhibitions had been unusual. A masked woman performer who could split playing cards edgewise at 30 paces, hit moving targets while blindfolded, and shoot quarters out of the air. The show had drawn huge crowds and even bigger side bets, until one day the mysterious markswoman simply vanished. As the autumn days grew shorter, Lucy continued her routine, but those who knew her best noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Her movements became more precise, her attention more focused. She spent more time near the windows, and her right hand strayed more often to the pocket of her apron, where some suspected she kept more than just a handkerchief. The world beyond the Silver Star's swinging doors was about to change, though few could have predicted how dramatically. The approaching winter winds carried more than just the promise of snow to Silver Pine. They brought with them a band of ruthless outlaws who were about to learn a deadly lesson about judging books by their covers, and a quiet saloon girl who'd ended more gunfights than all of them combined. Silver Pine shimmered like a mirage in the mountain air, its weathered buildings standing defiant against the bitter autumn wind. The town had earned its name not just from the towering pines that surrounded it, but from the way those same trees whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. At the heart of this rugged paradise stood the Silver Star Saloon, its faded grandeur a testament to dreams both fulfilled and broken. Lucy's morning routine at the Silver Star never varied. She arrived just as dawn painted the mountains gold, her boots leaving precise tracks in the morning frost. Old Jake had long stopped questioning why she insisted on being the first to arrive and the last to leave, or why she spent those quiet morning hours meticulously cleaning every glass until it sparkled like the crystals in the nearby mines. Dr. Sarah Chen, who maintained a small practice above the general store, had her own observations about Lucy's peculiar habits. She'd noticed how the saloon girl always cleaned tables in a specific pattern, one that gave her clear sightlines to every entrance and shadow. The doctor had served as a field medic during the border wars, and something in Lucy's movements reminded her of the scout units she'd treated. That same controlled awareness, that same readiness masked as routine. The women of Silver Pine had their own theories about Lucy Blackwood. Martha Whitney, who ran the boarding house, noticed how Lucy's calloused hands seemed at odds with her refined manners. "Those ain't the hands of someone who just started working for a living," she'd observed to the ladies' sewing circle. "Those are the hands of someone who's known gunpowder and steel." Lucy had a particular way with the saloon's rougher customers that sparked endless speculation. She never raised her voice, never showed fear, but troublemakers seemed to lose their nerve under her steady gaze. Hank Dawson, a local rancher, once saw her deal with 3 drunk miners who were harassing one of the younger serving girls. Lucy had simply placed a hand on the leader's shoulder and whispered something in his ear. The man's face had gone white as fresh snow, and all 3 miners had stumbled out into the night, never to return. The town's blacksmith, Miguel Ortiz, had his own encounter with Lucy's mysterious nature. One afternoon, while delivering new hinges to the saloon, he'd noticed her examining his tools with expert eyes. When he mentioned that he also repaired firearms, something had flickered in her expression. They'd spent the next hour discussing the intricacies of various firing mechanisms, Lucy's knowledge far too detailed for someone who claimed to have only a passing interest in shooting. Even the hardened men who frequented the Silver Star had begun to notice odd details. How Lucy could tell a man was carrying a concealed weapon just by the way he walked. How she could spot a card sharp's moves from across the room. how she seemed to know exactly when a friendly game of poker was about to turn deadly, appearing with fresh drinks at precisely the right moment to defuse tension. The Silver Star itself seemed to have changed since Lucy's arrival. The saloon's regular clientele noted how the usual rough crowd had gradually been replaced by a more respectable sort. Card games were more honest, disputes were settled without violence, and even the quality of whiskey had improved. Some said it was old Jake's doing, but those who paid attention knew it was Lucy's subtle influence at work. Young Tommy Martinez, while helping his father deliver firewood to the saloon, swore he'd seen Lucy practicing behind the stables one morning. He described how she could roll a coin across her knuckles while simultaneously maintaining perfect awareness of everything around her, a trick he'd only ever seen performed by professional gunfighters who needed to keep their hands nimble. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Lucy moved through the Silver Star with practiced ease, each step deliberate, each movement choreographed as if part of an elaborate dance. She had a way of anticipating needs before they were voiced. A fresh drink appeared just as a glass emptied. A potential argument was diffused before tempers could flare. A lonely soul found a sympathetic ear at exactly the right moment. But those who knew her best noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Her movements had become more precise, her attention more focused, and her right hand strayed more often to that mysterious pocket in her apron. The world beyond the Silver Star's swinging doors was about to change, though few could have predicted how dramatically. The three strangers who'd just ridden into town were about to learn that in Silver Pine, some angels carried more than just prayers beneath their aprons. Marshal Walker had grown increasingly curious about the Silver Star's mysterious barmaid. 20 years of wearing a badge had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about Lucy Blackwood set every one of those instincts humming like a plucked guitar string. It wasn't anything obvious, more like the feeling you get when you know a storm's coming, even though the sky's still clear. He'd started keeping a careful log of the subtle changes in Silver Pine since her arrival. The usual troublemakers who once plagued his jail cells now gave the Silver Star a wide berth. Card sharks who used to fleece miners of their pay somehow never managed to establish themselves anymore. Even the notorious Hawkins gang who'd terrorized. 3 territories had ridden through town last month without incident, though the marshal hadn't missed how Lucy's eyes had tracked them with the cold calculation of a mountain cat sizing up its prey. "You ever notice," he said to Deadeye Thompson one quiet afternoon, "how she never seems to walk the same way twice to work?" The gunsmith nodded slowly, pleased someone else had spotted it. "Changes her route daily. Always knows what's behind her, never lets herself get boxed in. Ain't seen movement patterns like that since I served with Chamberlain's sharpshooters in '69. The town's children had turned watching Lucy into something of a game, though their observations proved more revealing than they knew. Little Sarah Jenkins swore she'd seen Lucy practicing with a lasso behind the stables, her movements too precise to be mere play. Tommy Martinez claimed he'd watched her calculate distances by eye alone, correctly guessing the range to various targets with uncanny accuracy. Young Billy Chen had even started a notebook documenting her daily patterns, though he couldn't explain why he found them so fascinating. Miss Catherine Wells, the librarian, had perhaps the most intriguing insights. "It's not just that she reads military histories," she confided to Dr. Chen over tea. "It's the way she corrects the tactical errors in them. Last week she spent an hour explaining to me why Sergeant McPherson's account of the Battle of Copper Creek had to be wrong, based on wind conditions and shooting angles. Said no experienced marksman would have attempted those shots the way he described them." The doctor had merely nodded, remembering how she'd seen Lucy adjusting the angle of her serving tray to account for the afternoon glare, just like a shooter adjusting for sun position. Doña Maria's grandson, Felipe, who helped, maintained the town's telegraph office, had his own story to share. He'd noticed how Lucy always seemed to be within earshot when important messages came through, particularly those concerning outlaw movements in the territory. More telling was how she occasionally corrected the Morse code translations, catching errors that only someone with military communications training should have spotted. The Silver Star's regular patrons had developed their own theories about their mysterious barmaid. Old prospector Jim Hawkins swore he'd seen her calculations scratched into the back of a whiskey barrel, complex mathematics involving trajectories and wind speeds, though they'd vanished by the next morning. Samuel Reed, who drove the weekly stage from Denver, claimed he'd watched her handle a broken wheel with the precise movements of someone who understood exactly where to place leverage for maximum effect. But it was Reverend Matthews who perhaps came closest to understanding the truth. He'd been sitting on his porch one Sunday afternoon when he saw Lucy walking home from church. A group of young boys had been playing with a new ball, and when it went wild, Lucy had caught it with one fluid motion, not the awkward grab of someone surprised, but the precise interception of someone who had calculated its trajectory before it was even thrown. Reminded me, he later told his wife, of how my old shooting instructor used to track moving targets. Same grace, same precision, same absolute certainty. The town's Chinese laundry owner, Mr. Wu, had witnessed something equally telling. While delivering linens to the saloon, he'd spotted Lucy practicing what looked like simple dance steps in the early morning light. But having served in his homeland's Imperial Guard, he recognized the movements for what they really were, the precise footwork patterns used by elite marksmen to maintain perfect balance while shooting on the move. Even the animals seemed to sense something different about her. The town's most ill-tempered horse, a mean-spirited stallion that had thrown every would-be rider, grew oddly calm when Lucy passed. Like he recognizes a predator, the stablemaster had observed. Same way horses get real still when they smell a mountain lion nearby. As autumn deepened and the first hints of winter touched the mountain air, these observations began to coalesce into something more concrete. The way Lucy could read a room's mood before anyone else sensed trouble. How she could spot a concealed weapon at 20 paces. The precise way she handled everything from bottles to brooms, as if constantly maintaining muscle memory for something far more lethal than serving drinks. Marshal Walker had started asking discreet questions in neighboring towns, sending carefully worded telegrams to old contacts. The responses painted an intriguing pattern. Stories of a legendary female sharpshooter who'd performed in shooting exhibitions back east, known for her uncanny accuracy and theatrical flair. She'd vanished abruptly after a private shooting. Competition went wrong, leaving behind a dead card cheat and a lot of unanswered questions. The timing of her disappearance coincided perfectly with Lucy's arrival in Silver Pine, but now, as three hard-faced strangers settled into rooms across the street, those who knew Lucy best noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. Her movements, always precise, took on an almost predatory grace. Her attention, typically divided between various tasks, focused with laser intensity on the newcomers. And that mysterious pocket in her apron seemed to carry something that made a distinctive sound when she moved. A sound that any experienced gun hand would recognize as the soft click of a finely tuned hammer being checked. The three strangers, who'd ridden into Silver Pine that morning, brought with them an air of menace as sharp as the mountain wind. They carried themselves with the easy arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, their gun belts worn low and tied down. The mark of men who used their weapons for more than just show. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scarred face who called himself Jackson, had eyes that reminded old Jake of a rattler sizing up its prey. The Silver Star grew quiet when they entered, conversation dying like a flame in a sudden wind. Lucy was wiping glasses behind the bar, her movements never faltering as she tracked their arrival in the reflection of the mirror behind the whiskey bottles. If she noticed how they spread out in a practice pattern, one at the bar, one near the door, one covering the room from a corner table, she gave no sign. "Whiskey," Jackson demanded, dropping a coin on the bar with deliberate force. "Leave the bottle." His voice carried the rough edge of someone used to being obeyed without question. Lucy placed a bottle and glass before him with fluid grace, her movements precise and controlled. Those who knew her best might have noticed how she positioned herself to keep all three men in her peripheral vision, how she maintained a specific distance from Jackson's reach. The afternoon crawled by with the tense anticipation of a gathering. Storm. The strangers drank steadily but carefully, maintaining just enough sobriety to keep their edge. They asked questions that seemed casual but carried hidden weight, about the town's routine, about the sheriff's habits, about the schedule of the silver shipments from the nearby mines. Lucy served them with the same efficient courtesy she showed all customers, but those watching closely noticed how she always seemed to be within earshot of their conversations. "Ain't often you see such a pretty thing in a place like this," the man by the door, a weasel-faced character who'd introduced himself as Reeves, commented as Lucy passed. His smile never reached his cold eyes. "Might be we should take you with us when we leave, give you a taste of real excitement." His hand reached for her arm with practiced speed. What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses later disagreed on the exact sequence of events. Lucy seemed to merely shift her weight, a subtle movement like a dancer changing position. Somehow, Reeves found his reaching hand trapped against the bar, his wrist locked in a position that made his eyes water with pain. The bottle Lucy had been carrying never even wavered. "That would be unwise," she said softly, her refined accent carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Her grip appeared delicate, almost gentle, but Reeves' face had gone pale with the realization that he couldn't break free without breaking something in his own arm. More telling was how she maintained perfect awareness of the other two men, her position carefully calculated to use Reeves as a shield if needed. Jackson's hand had drifted toward his gun, but he froze at the sound of a distinctive click from beneath Lucy's serving tray, a sound any experienced gunman would recognize. The third man, a heavy-set brute called Mason, had half risen from his corner table, but something in Lucy's stance made him reconsider. "My apologies, ma'am," Jackson said slowly, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man who suddenly realized he's miscalculated badly. "My friend's manners need work. We mean no disrespect." His eyes showed the first glimmer of uncertainty, recognizing something in Lucy's bearing that set off warning bells in his predator's instincts. Lucy released Reeves, with the same fluid grace she'd used to trap him. "No offense taken," she replied pleasantly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But those who knew what to look for noticed how she maintained perfect positioning, how her right hand never strayed far from her apron pocket, how her eyes tracked every subtle movement the men made. Dr. Chen, who'd witnessed the entire exchange from her usual table, recognized the technical perfection of Lucy's movements. The way she'd trapped Reeves's hand had been a standard disarming technique taught to elite shooting instructors, but executed with a level of skill that spoke of years of practice. More telling was how Lucy had automatically adjusted her stance to account for the uneven floorboard near the bar, the kind of instinctive compensation that only came from extensive combat training. The incident seemed to end there, but subtle changes rippled through the saloon. The three strangers huddled closer together, their confrontational swagger replaced by wary calculation. They spoke in lower voices, casting occasional glances at Lucy that held more speculation than lechery. More telling was how they'd shifted their chairs to keep her in view, the instinctive response of predators who've suddenly realized they might be prey. Marshal Walker, who'd witnessed the exchange through the saloon's window, made his own calculations. He'd seen that particular wrist lock before, during a demonstration at a shooting competition back in '71. The instructor had been explaining how marksmen needed to know close-quarter combat techniques for when shooting wasn't practical. But only a handful of people had ever mastered it to the level Lucy had just displayed. The rest of the afternoon carried a different kind of tension. The strangers stayed at their table, drinking less and watching more. Lucy continued her duties with the same efficient grace, but those who knew her best noticed subtle changes. Her movements had taken on an almost predatory economy, every step precisely calculated. She'd positioned herself to keep both the main entrance and the back door in view, and her right hand stayed closer to that mysterious apron pocket. Old Jake had seen enough trouble in his years running the Silver Star to recognize the signs. The way Lucy moved reminded him of a mountain cat he'd once watched stalking deer, all fluid grace and deadly purpose, just waiting for the right moment to strike. He began quietly moving his more expensive bottles to the lower shelves, a subtle preparation for whatever was coming. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the saloon's windows, more subtle changes became apparent. Regular customers found excuses to leave, responding to some instinctive warning in the air. Those who remained moved their chairs away from the central floor, creating clear lines of fire, though few could have explained why they felt the need to do so. The three strangers remained, but their demeanor had shifted noticeably. They spoke in whispers, casting calculating glances between Lucy and the doorway. Jackson's scarred face showed the concentration of a man reassessing a situation that had suddenly become more complicated than planned. But perhaps most telling was how none of them turned their backs to the bar anymore, treating the seemingly delicate barmaid with the cautious respect usually reserved for unsheathed weapons. As evening settled over Silver Pine like a worn blanket, the incident with the strangers had stirred up more than just immediate tension. It had awakened old memories and half-forgotten stories that cast new light on the mysterious barmaid's possible origins. Miss Catherine Wells, organizing her library's newspaper collection, discovered something interesting in a yellowed copy of the Denver Chronicle from 8 months ago. The article described a remarkable shooting exhibition at the Colorado State Fair, where a masked woman performer had astounded crowds with feats of marksmanship that seemed almost supernatural. The Lady in Blue, as she was known, could hit moving targets while blindfolded, split playing cards edgewise at 30 paces, and shoot coins out of the air. But what caught Catherine's attention was the description of the shooter's distinctive style, a fluid grace that made lethal accuracy look like an elegant dance. She disappeared right after a private shooting competition went wrong, Catherine told Dr. Chen in hushed tones. A notorious gambler was found dead, shot through the heart at impossible range. The official verdict was self-defense, but she vanished before authorities could question her further. The timing matched perfectly with Lucy's arrival in Silver Pine. Marshal Walker had received his own troubling information. A telegram from his old friend in the Texas Rangers spoke of a legendary female sharpshooter who'd helped them track down the infamous Clayton gang. She'd appeared out of nowhere, offering her services as a shooting instructor for their rangers. Her methods were revolutionary, combining traditional marksmanship with an understanding of mathematics and human behavior that transformed good shooters into exceptional ones. But here's the strange part, the telegram continued. After the Clayton gang was eliminated, we discovered every member had died from a single perfect shot, the kind of shooting that takes more than just skill. It requires a level of precision that borders on artistry. She disappeared shortly after, leaving only a note thanking us for the opportunity to practice her craft. The town's gunsmith, Deadeye Thompson, had been examining the strange marks left on Reeves' wrist after his encounter with Lucy. "Seen that pattern before," he muttered to the marshal. Back during the border wars, there was a special unit of female scouts and sharpshooters. They developed their own fighting techniques, combining close-quarter combat with gunfighting in ways nobody had seen before. The way she locked his arm, that was their signature move. Doña Maria added another piece to the puzzle. While sorting through her late husband's military papers, she'd found references to a mysterious figure known as La Ángel de la Muerte, the Angel of Death. This legendary markswoman had appeared during the border conflicts, helping Mexican villages defend against raiders. Witnesses described her as having the face of an angel, but the eyes of a seasoned killer, able to shoot with deadly accuracy while maintaining the poise of a classical dancer. The saloon's regular patrons began sharing their own stories, each adding another layer to the growing mystery. A traveling merchant recalled a shooting competition in St. Louis, where a young woman had outshot every male competitor, only to vanish when questions arose about her background. A retired cavalry officer remembered rumors of a female shooter who'd helped train army marksmen, demonstrating techniques that seemed impossible until she proved them practical. But perhaps the most intriguing account came from old Jake himself. Late that evening, as the tension in the saloon continued to build, he finally shared a story he'd been keeping to himself. Years ago, while running a different saloon in Kansas, he'd witnessed a remarkable incident. A group of outlaws had attempted to rob his establishment, only to be stopped by a young woman who moved like flowing water and shot like desert lightning. "Never seen anything like it," he told Marshal Walker, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 men, all experienced gun hands, and she dropped them before they could clear leather. But it wasn't just the shooting that stuck with me. It was how she moved, how she'd positioned herself long before trouble started, like she'd choreographed the whole thing in advance. As Jake spoke, both men watched Lucy gracefully navigating the evening crowd, noting how she maintained perfect awareness of the 3 strangers while appearing completely at ease. Her movements did indeed suggest a carefully planned choreography, each step precise, each position offering both coverage and clear lines of sight. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, like a puzzle slowly revealing its true picture. The mysterious shooting instructor in Texas, the masked performer in Colorado, the guardian angel of the border villages, all shared distinctive characteristics that seemed to point to a single remarkable individual. Someone who combined lethal skill with elegant grace, who could switch between refined lady and deadly shooter as easily as others changed clothes. Dr. Chen, watching Lucy's precise movements from her usual table, remembered something from her time as a field medic. "The best shooters I treated during the wars," she told Catherine, "all shared a certain quality. They didn't just shoot well, they understood the geometry of violence, the mathematics of movement. They could read a situation like others read books, calculating angles and trajectories instinctively." The 3 strangers, still nursing their drinks in the corner, seemed to be having their own revelation. Their wary glances and whispered conversations suggested they were piecing together their own version of Lucy's possible identity. Jackson's scarred face showed the growing concern of a man realizing he might have stumbled into something far more dangerous than anticipated. As night settled more firmly over Silver Pine, the Silver Star had become unnaturally quiet. The usual evening crowd had thinned to a handful of regulars, all of them positioned with careful casualness around the room's edges. Lucy continued her duties with fluid grace, but those who knew what to look for could see the subtle signs of preparation in her movements. The way she'd cleared certain angles of fire, how she'd positioned bottles to provide cover if needed, the careful distance she maintained from potential threats. The mystery of Lucy Blackwood had deepened from a simple puzzle into something far more complex. She wasn't just a barmaid with unusual skills. She was beginning to appear more like a legend who had chosen to hide in plain sight. a deadly force wrapped in the gentle appearance of a saloon girl. And as the tension continued to build in the Silver Star, those who were paying attention began to wonder not if her true nature would be revealed, but when. The tension in the Silver Star had reached a fever pitch as night settled firmly over Silver Pine. The three strangers had been joined by four more hard-faced men who'd slipped into town under cover of dusk, their arrival noted by Lucy's ever-watchful eyes. They carried themselves with the same predatory grace as Jackson's original group, their gun belts worn low and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Jackson's scarred face showed grim satisfaction as his reinforcements settled into strategic positions around the saloon. Their arrangement wasn't random. They'd positioned themselves to cover all exits and key points in the room. It was the kind of tactical deployment that spoke of military training or extensive experience in violent confrontations. Lucy's response to the newcomers was subtle but telling. She adjusted her movements with fluid precision, adapting her path between tables to maintain optimal distance from potential threats. Those who knew what to look for noticed how she'd slightly repositioned several tables, creating clear lanes through the room while ensuring adequate cover was always within reach. "Mighty quiet night," Jackson commented, his voice carrying an edge of anticipation, almost like folks knew to stay home. His eyes followed Lucy's graceful movement behind the bar, no longer showing any trace of the lecherous interest from earlier. Now his gaze held the careful calculation of a man sizing up a serious threat. Old Jake had seen enough bar fights to recognize the signs of impending violence. The way the strangers kept their hands close to their weapons, how they'd arranged themselves to support each other if trouble started, the subtle signals they exchanged when Lucy moved past. But what truly concerned him was how Lucy seemed to be preparing the saloon itself, like a chess master arranging pieces before a crucial game. Dr. Chen, still at her usual table, noticed how Lucy had been subtly moving certain regular customers to safer positions throughout the evening. The town's schoolteacher had been gently guided to a spot behind a thick support beam. The elderly Mr. Peterson had found himself mysteriously relocated to a corner table with solid walls on two sides. Even the doctor's own table had been casually adjusted to provide better coverage. Marshal Walker, watching through the saloon's front window, saw more riders approaching from the east. These men moved with the same predatory purpose as Jackson's group, their horses' hooves muffled by cloth wrapped around them, an old trick used by raiders and outlaws to mask their approach. "7 more coming," he muttered to Deadeye Thompson, who joined him in his surveillance. "That makes 14 in total." The gunsmith's weathered face showed grim understanding. They weren't just here to cause trouble. This was a carefully planned operation with a specific purpose. Inside the Silver Star, Lucy's movements had taken on an almost hypnotic quality. She seemed to flow between tables like water finding its path, each step precise, each position carefully calculated. Her right hand stayed closer to her apron pocket, where the outline of something distinctly gun-shaped was becoming more noticeable to those who knew what to look for. "You know," Jackson said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet saloon, "there's been something bothering me all day." He turned his scarred face toward Lucy, who continued wiping glasses with perfect composure. "That shooting competition in Denver 8 months ago, the one where Bloody Bill Matthews met his end." Lucy's movements didn't falter, but something changed in her bearing, a subtle shift from contained grace to coiled readiness. The other patrons felt the change in the air, like the electric tension before a lightning strike. "Funny thing about that night," Jackson continued, his hand casually dropping below the bar's edge. "Bill was the best shot in 3 territories. Nobody could figure out how someone put a bullet through his heart at 60 paces in near total darkness. Nobody except those who'd heard stories about a certain lady shooter who could hit targets blindfolded. The newest arrivals had begun filtering into the saloon, trying to appear casual as they took up positions that had clearly been planned in advance. Lucy's eyes tracked their movement in the bar mirror, her expression unchanged, but her body subtly adjusting to the new threats. Of course, that same lady shooter had quite a reputation, Jackson pressed on, his voice taking on a harder edge. They say she could drop 6 men before they could clear leather. Say she moved like a dancer, but shot like the devil himself. Some even say she worked with the Texas Rangers, teaching them tricks that seemed impossible until she proved them practical. The atmosphere in the Silver Star had become unbearably tense. Regular customers found themselves frozen in place, instinctively, aware that they were witnessing the moments before something explosive. Even the usual evening sounds, the clink of glasses, the creak of floorboards, seemed muted, as if the saloon itself was holding its breath. But you know what the really interesting part is? Jackson's scarred face split in a predatory grin. Word is, she disappeared right after collecting a mighty big prize purse. Same purse that our employer's been mighty interested in recovering, along with making sure she can't testify about certain business arrangements she might have overheard. Lucy finally turned to face Jackson directly, her movements liquid smooth. Her refined accent carried clearly through the silent saloon. How fascinating. And does your employer still believe that sending mere triggermen to handle such a delicate matter is wise? The subtle emphasis she placed on mere triggermen caused several of the newcomers to shift uneasily. They'd come expecting to intimidate a simple barmaid, but something in Lucy's stance, in the cold certainty of her voice, made them suddenly question their odds. 14 against 1, Jackson stated, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Even the famous Lady in Blue can't beat those odds. Lucy's smile was as elegant as it was terrifying. An interesting theory, though I notice you're assuming all 14 of you will be able to draw at the same time. A rather optimistic calculation, given the current positioning of your men. Her words caused several of the gunmen to suddenly realize how she'd been manipulating their positions throughout the evening. They found themselves arranged in ways that would make supporting each other difficult, with obstacles that would hinder their movement at crucial moments. The Silver Star had become a powder keg awaiting a spark. Outside, Marshal Walker and Deadeye, Thompson exchanged knowing looks, recognizing that the quiet barmaid who'd brought such subtle changes to their town was about to reveal her true nature in a way that would be remembered for years to come. Time seemed to freeze in the Silver Star as Lucy's words hung in the air, heavy with deadly promise. Jackson's scarred face showed the first traces of real concern as he finally recognized the tactical trap he and his men had walked into. Their carefully planned ambush had somehow been turned against them before they'd even arrived. "You've been moving us around all evening," he said slowly, the realization dawning in his eyes. "Every time you served a drink, cleared a table, suggested a better spot to sit, you were positioning us exactly where you wanted us." Lucy's smile remained graceful as ever, though now it carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "The art of the dance isn't just about the steps you take," she replied, her refined accent making the words more menacing. "It's about understanding how to make others move without them realizing they're following your lead." The 14 gunmen were starting to notice the full implications of their positioning. 2 found themselves behind a thick wooden post that would prevent them from drawing smoothly. 3 others realized they were lined up in such a way that they'd risk shooting each other if they tried to fire simultaneously. The rest discovered that various obstacles, tables, chairs, support beams, had been subtly arranged to restrict their movement. "But perhaps more interesting," Lucy continued, casually adjusting a glass on the bar, "is how none of you questioned why I spent so much time cleaning these mirrors today." She gestured to the large mirrors behind the bar, their surfaces gleaming in the lamplight. "They do provide such excellent views of blind spots, don't they?" One of the newer arrivals, a tall man with a snake tattoo on his neck, shifted nervously. "Boss, something ain't right here. The way she's talking, the way she's standing, this ain't no ordinary saloon girl." "Of course, mirrors can serve another purpose," Lucy added, her voice carrying that same deadly elegance. "They're quite useful for calculating angles, especially when considering the mathematics of deflected shots." Her hand hadn't moved toward her apron pocket yet, but her posture suggested she could reach her weapon with devastating speed. Old Jake, watching from behind his bar, noticed something else. Throughout the evening, Lucy had been subtly positioning bottles on specific shelves, creating what he now realized were potential ricochet points. He'd seen trick shooters use similar setups in exhibitions, but never in a way that suggested such lethal intent. "You know what your mistake was?" Lucy asked, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Not the poor tactical deployment, though that is rather amateur. Not the obvious approach into town, telegraphing your arrival hours in advance. Not even the painfully transparent attempt to gather intelligence through clumsy questions." She moved slightly, a motion so fluid it seemed almost casual, but it placed her in a position that gave her clear lines of fire to multiple targets while using the bar as cover. "Your real mistake was assuming that because I chose to pour drinks in a quiet mountain town, I had somehow lost my edge." Dr. Chen, from her carefully positioned table, recognized the technical perfection of Lucy's stance. It was a modified version of a championship shooting position, adapted for close-quarter combat. The doctor had seen similar stances during the border wars, but never executed with such precise calculation. "Last chance," Jackson said, though his voice lacked conviction. 14 guns against 1. No matter how good you are, you can't possibly—" "3," Lucy interrupted softly. "What? You have 3 guns that could actually be brought to bear in the first crucial seconds. The rest," her smile was coldly amused, "are currently in tactically unsuitable positions. Would you like me to explain the mathematics of why?" One of the gunmen near the window suddenly realized that the angle of the glass, combined with the last rays of sunset, would blind him momentarily if he tried to aim in Lucy's direction. Another noticed that his gun hand was currently behind a support post that would cost him precious fractions of a second to clear. "But since we're discussing numbers," Lucy continued, her voice carrying that same refined deadliness, "perhaps we should consider some other calculations, like the fact that Marshal Walker and Deadeye Thompson have been covering the front entrance for the past 10 minutes. Or that Miguel Ortiz has his shotgun trained on the back door from the stable." The revelation that they were caught in a crossfire caused several of the gunmen to shift nervously, but Lucy wasn't finished. "Then there's the matter of the mirror angles I mentioned. Would anyone care to guess how many pre-calculated ricochet shots I've arranged? Here's a hint. I spent 3 hours adjusting the positions of these bottles and glasses precisely. The level of preparation she was describing went far beyond simple self-defense. This was the work of someone who approached combat like a chess master, seeing dozens of moves ahead and preparing for multiple contingencies. "You're bluffing," Jackson said, but his face had gone pale. "Nobody can make shots like that in real combat. Those are exhibition tricks." Lucy's laugh was like silver bells with steel cores. "Would you like to test that theory? I must warn you, the last man who made that assumption was Bloody Bill Matthews, and he never got the chance to revise his opinion. The tension in the Silver Star had reached a breaking point. The regular customers had become statues, barely daring to breathe. Old Jake had quietly ducked behind his reinforced bar, while Dr. Chen had already opened her medical bag, anticipating what was to come. "However," Lucy added, her tone almost conversational, "there is one calculation you might find particularly interesting." Her right hand still hadn't moved toward her apron pocket, but her entire body radiated lethal readiness. Would you like to know the exact number of men I've put down in situations like this? I assure you, it's a significantly higher figure than 14. The command in Jackson's voice was fraying at the edges as he said, "Nobody's that fast. Nobody's that good." "An interesting hypothesis," Lucy replied, her refined accent making the words sound like a death sentence. "Though I should point out, you're assuming I haven't already begun." That's when they noticed the sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking coming from somewhere in the room. One of the gunmen glanced down and realized with horror that his gun's hammer had been subtly loosened, something that could only have happened when Lucy passed by earlier, making it appear she'd stumbled against him. "You see," Lucy continued, as more of the men began checking their weapons with growing panic, "a truly skilled dancer knows that the performance begins long before the music starts. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events." Jackson's fraying nerves finally snapped, and he went for his gun with the speed that had made him infamous in 3 territories. But Lucy had already begun moving before his muscles even tensed for the draw. Her first shot came from a small derringer that seemed to materialize in her hand like magic, the report surprisingly quiet for such a deadly weapon. The bullet caught Jackson's gun hand with surgical precision, sending his revolver spinning away before he could level it. In the same fluid motion, she dropped to one knee behind the bar, using its reinforced wood as cover. 2 of the gunmen near the window managed to clear leather, but Lucy had already anticipated their response. A lightning-fast shot ricocheted off one of her carefully positioned bottles, catching the first man in the shoulder. The second's gun hand was suddenly entangled in the curtain cord she'd subtly repositioned earlier that evening. "I did try to warn you about the mathematics of deflected shots." Lucy's refined voice carried clearly over the chaos, as calm as if she were still serving drinks. Her next 2 shots came in rapid succession, each bullet seeming to take impossible paths off mirrors and glassware before finding their marks with devastating accuracy. Dr. Chen, watching from her protected position, recognized the technical perfection of Lucy's shooting. Each shot was precisely calculated, using principles of geometry and physics that the doctor had only seen theoretical papers about. This wasn't just skilled marksmanship, it was combat turned into an exact science. The man with the snake tattoo tried to circle around behind a table for a better angle, only to discover that the furniture had been subtly arranged to create a channeling effect. He found himself forced into a position that left him exposed to both Lucy's line of fire and Marshal Walker's coverage from outside. "The fascinating thing about tactical positioning," Lucy commented, her voice still carrying that deadly elegance, as she dropped another attacker with a ricochet shot that seemed to defy physics, "is how few people consider the 3-dimensional aspects of combat geometry." As if to demonstrate her point, her next shot struck a hanging lamp at precisely the right angle, causing it to swing in a calculated arc. The moving shadow it cast momentarily blinded 3 of the gunmen who had been trying to coordinate their attack, disrupting their timing just long enough for Lucy to neutralize them with terrifying efficiency. Jake, peering over his reinforced bar, watched in amazement as Lucy continued her deadly performance. Every move she made had been planned well in advance. Every shot seemed to be part of an elaborate choreography. She wasn't just reacting to the fight. She was conducting it like a maestro leading a deadly orchestra. "Your employer," Lucy continued, her refined accent somehow making her words more menacing as she disabled another attacker with seemingly impossible precision, "clearly failed to mention certain details about my background. Though I suppose that's understandable. Few people survive long enough to report accurately on my methods." The remaining gunmen were beginning to realize the full extent of their predicament. They weren't just facing a skilled shooter. They were caught in an intricately planned trap where every angle, every shadow, every piece of furniture had been arranged to ensure their defeat. Lucy had turned the entire saloon into a deadly calculation, with themselves as the variables in her lethal equation. For instance, she added, using the mirror behind the bar to place a perfect shot that caught a flanking attacker through a gap he didn't even know existed. Most people don't appreciate how sound can be used to mask the direction of gunfire. The acoustics in here are quite fascinating when properly utilized. As if to demonstrate, her next series of shots seemed to come from multiple directions, the echoes carefully planned to create confusion. 3 more attackers went down, unable to determine where the real threats were coming from amid the choreographed chaos of sound and motion. Marshal Walker, watching through the window, recognized the technique from old war stories. There had been legends about a female shooting instructor who had revolutionized combat tactics, teaching soldiers how to use environmental factors like sound and light as weapons. But seeing it executed with such lethal perfection was something else entirely. You know what truly fascinating detail your employer overlooked? Lucy's voice carried clearly as she continued her deadly dance, each movement precise and calculated. The mathematical relationship between a shooter's skill and their tactical options. You see, when you can guarantee your shot placement to within a quarter-inch at any range, it opens up rather interesting possibilities. To demonstrate her point, she fired a shot that struck a brass fixture, deflected off a mirror, caught a suspended bottle at precisely the right angle, and finally found its mark, disarming one of the remaining gunmen without causing serious injury. The level of calculation required for such a shot was beyond what most people would consider possible. The few attackers still standing had lost all semblance of coordination. They found themselves caught in a web of precisely calculated angles and carefully arranged obstacles, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear effectively. Lucy had transformed the saloon into a geometric puzzle where every solution led to their defeat. I should mention, she added, her voice carrying that same deadly refinement as she continued to systematically dismantle their attack, that I've actually been rather gentle so far. These shots are specifically calculated to disable rather than kill. Would anyone care to see what happens when I adjust my calculations for maximum lethality? The threat, delivered in the same tone she might use to offer a drink, caused several of the remaining gunmen to freeze. They had come expecting to overwhelm a simple barmaid with superior numbers. Instead, they found themselves at the mercy of someone who had turned violence into an art form, who could calculate killing shots with the same ease that others might. To calculate a bar tab, Dr. Chen noticed something remarkable about Lucy's technique. Despite the chaos of the fight, she maintained perfect form with every shot, her movements as precise and controlled as a surgeon's. Each bullet was placed with exacting accuracy, causing exactly as much damage as she intended. No more, no less. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had demonstrated a level of skill and preparation that seemed almost supernatural. 14 skilled gunmen had been systematically disabled by a single shooter who had turned the entire saloon into an elaborate trap, using physics and geometry as deadly weapons. As the echo of the final shot faded, Lucy stood with fluid grace, her derringer still smoking slightly. The saloon floor was littered with groaning men, each disabled with surgical precision, none fatally wounded, but all thoroughly convinced of their mistake in underestimating her. "Now then," she said, her refined accent carrying clearly through the gun-smoke-filled air, "shall we discuss what message you'll be taking back to your employer about the wisdom of his current course of action?" The smoke hadn't yet cleared from the Silver Star when Marshal Walker stepped through the swinging doors, his experienced eyes taking in the aftermath of Lucy's devastating performance. 14 of the territory's most dangerous gunmen lay scattered across the saloon floor, each one disabled with surgical precision, none dead, but all thoroughly convinced of their mortality. "Remarkable shooting," he commented, his voice carrying the weight of professional appreciation. "Particularly that ricochet pattern you set up with the mirrors. Haven't seen anything like that since the exhibition in St. Louis back in '71. His emphasis on the date caused Lucy's eyebrow to raise slightly. "You were there?" she asked, her refined accent unchanged despite the recent violence. She was already moving through the room with that same fluid grace, checking on the regular customers who had witnessed her performance. "Fourth row, near the center," Walker confirmed. "Watched a masked lady shooter demonstrate how geometry and physics could turn any room into a tactical advantage. Called herself the mathematical marvel, as I recall." He paused, studying her face. Though the army instructors who hired her afterward knew her by a different name, Lucy's smile held a mix of appreciation and warning. "Those records were supposed to be sealed." "They were," Walker agreed, "but some stories are too remarkable to stay buried. Like how a mysterious shooting instructor revolutionized military combat tactics, teaching soldiers to use sound, light, and geometry as weapons. Or how she disappeared after discovering certain officers were selling information to outlaws." Dr. Chen, who had begun treating the wounded men, added her own observation. "Your shot placement is exceptional, each bullet delivered precisely. Enough damage to disable without risking fatal injury. That takes more than just skill. It requires intimate knowledge of human anatomy." "A lady should be well-rounded in her education," Lucy replied with elegant understatement, though her eyes showed appreciation for the doctor's insight. Jackson, his gun hand professionally bandaged by Dr. Chen, looked up at Lucy with a mix of fear and revelation. "The lady in blue," he said softly. "The one who turned the Denver shooting competition into a massacre when she discovered it was being used to cover illegal arms deals. They said she could calculate bullet trajectories. In her head, turn any space into a killing ground." "An exaggeration," Lucy demurred, though her smile carried a deadly edge. "I simply appreciate the poetry of mathematics when applied to practical problems. Though your employer might be interested to know that I've kept detailed records of all his business arrangements, including the real reason he wanted me eliminated." Old Jake, surveying his saloon with mixed emotions, noticed something remarkable. Despite the intensity of the gunfight, there was surprisingly little damage to his establishment. Each of Lucy's shots had been perfectly calculated not just for effect, but to minimize collateral damage. "You've been preparing this place since the day you arrived," he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Every mirror you insisted on cleaning, every piece of furniture you repositioned, every bottle you arranged so carefully, you were setting up firing solutions." Lucy's nod held professional appreciation. "A good shooter understands ballistics. A great shooter understands geometry. But true mastery requires understanding how to shape the battlefield itself." She gestured to the room's layout. "Every surface, every angle, every shadow can be turned to advantage if you understand the mathematics involved." Marshal Walker had begun examining the fallen gunman more closely, his experienced eye noting details. "These men aren't common outlaws," he observed. "Military training, professional gear, coordinated tactics. Someone spent a lot of money putting this team together." "Indeed," Lucy agreed, her refined accent making the word sharp as a razor. "Someone who thought 14 trained killers would be sufficient to eliminate a simple saloon girl. Though perhaps more interesting is why they felt such force was necessary." Deadeye Thompson, who had entered behind the marshal, added his own insight. "That shooting competition in Denver, the prize money wasn't just money, was it? You found something else, something that powerful men would kill to keep hidden." Lucy's smile was cold as mountain frost. "Let's just say that certain ledgers contain more than financial records. Names, dates, connections, a complete map of corruption that reaches from here to Washington." She adjusted her apron with precise movements. Though the truly fascinating aspect isn't the information itself, but how it's been distributed, Dr. Chen looked up from treating another wounded man, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You didn't just hide it," she said. "You divided it, encoded it, spread it across multiple locations, like a mathematical equation split into its component parts. Each piece meaningless alone," Lucy confirmed, "but when combined with the others..." She let the implications hang in the air like gun smoke. The remaining conscious gunmen exchanged worried looks as they realized the full implications of their failure. They hadn't just failed to eliminate a witness, they had apparently walked into an elaborate trap months in the making. "Your employer," Lucy continued, her voice carrying that same deadly elegance, "should understand that this was merely a demonstration, a proof of concept, if you will, showing exactly what happens to those who underestimate the mathematical precision of properly applied violence." Marshal Walker nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "You didn't come to Silver Point to hide," he said. "You came here to set a trap. You knew they'd eventually track you down, try to silence you." "A lady should always be prepared for uninvited guests," Lucy replied with elegant understatement. "Though I must admit, the tactical incompetence of this attempt is rather disappointing. I had calculated for much more challenging scenarios." The wounded men, hearing this casual dismissal of their efforts, showed a mix of humiliation and growing fear. They had come expecting to overwhelm a simple target with superior numbers. Instead, they had become unwitting participants in a demonstration of combat turned into mathematical art. "Consider this evening a message," Lucy addressed the fallen gunmen, her refined accent making the threat more menacing. "One that I trust you'll deliver with perfect clarity to your employer. Any further attempts to silence me will be met with significantly less gentle calculations." The implications of her words were clear. She had deliberately chosen to disable rather than kill, but that choice could easily be reversed. The precision she had demonstrated wasn't just skill, it was a warning of what she could do if truly pressed. As the last rays of sunset painted the saloon in shades of gold and shadow, Lucy's true nature stood revealed. She wasn't just a skilled shooter who had chosen to tend bar, but a tactical genius who had turned an entire saloon into an elaborate combat equation, with herself as the deadly variable that made it all work. As dawn painted the mountains gold, Silver Pine awakened to find itself transformed. The events at the Silver Star had shattered more than just the usual quiet of the mountain town. They had broken the comfortable illusion that had surrounded Lucy Blackwood for the past 8 months. The saloon itself bore surprisingly little evidence of the previous night's violence, each bullet hole and broken bottle telling a story of precise calculation rather than chaos. Lucy moved through the space with the same fluid grace she'd always shown, but now everyone could see the deadly beauty in her movements, the way she constantly calculated angles and positions, even while performing the simplest tasks. "You'll be leaving soon, I expect," Marshal Walker said, joining her as she arranged fresh flowers on the bar. It wasn't a question. The mathematics of the situation suggest it would be wise, Lucy replied, her refined accent unchanged. "Though, perhaps not in the way they're expecting." Her smile held secrets deeper than the mountain shadows. Old Jake, polishing glasses behind his bar, noticed how she still maintained perfect awareness of every entrance and shadow, even now. 8 months of preparation, he mused, setting up angles, establishing routines, building trust, all for one night's performance. "A lady should always plan ahead," Lucy responded with elegant understatement. "Though I must admit, the tactical possibilities of your establishment exceeded my initial calculations. The acoustic properties alone opened up fascinating trajectories I hadn't considered." Dr. Chen, finishing her morning check on the wounded men in the town jail, added her own observation. "You weren't just preparing the saloon," she said. You were preparing the whole town, teaching us to watch, to move, to position ourselves without even realizing we were learning. Lucy's smile held professional appreciation. The best lessons are those the student doesn't know they're receiving. Every time I suggested a better seat, guided someone to safer position, or demonstrated proper awareness, the town was learning. Deadeye. Thompson, who had stopped by to examine the remarkable shot patterns from the previous night, nodded in understanding. That's why you spent so much time with the children, teaching them games. You were training the next generation to be more observant, more tactically aware. A pleasant side benefit, Lucy agreed, though I must say young Tommy Martinez shows remarkable promise in calculating trajectories. He's already demonstrating an intuitive grasp of geometric principles that took me years to master. The morning. Light revealed more subtle details about Lucy's preparations. The seemingly random arrangement of bottles behind the bar now showed itself to be a carefully planned series of reflection points. The placement of every table, chair, and decoration had been calculated to provide cover, channel movement, or create tactical advantages. Your employer's men will be watching the roads, Marshal Walker noted, his tone carrying professional concern. Lucy's laugh was like silver bells with steel cores. Indeed, they're currently watching every trail, pass, and canyon leading out of Silver Pine. Their tactical deployment is actually quite impressive this time. She adjusted a flower with precise movements. It would be almost admirable if it weren't so mathematically flawed. Flawed how? Deadeye asked, though his growing smile suggested he was beginning to understand. They're assuming I plan to leave, Lucy explained, her refined accent making the words dance. A reasonable calculation based on standard tactical doctrine. However, she gestured to the arriving morning customers, each one moving with newly discovered awareness of space and position. They've failed to consider certain variables in their equation. Dr. Chen's eyes widened with realization. The town itself. You haven't just been preparing your own defense. You've been training an entire community in advanced tactical awareness. As I said, Lucy smiled, the best lessons are those learned without realizing you're being taught. Every person in Silver Pine has spent months absorbing principles of positioning, awareness, and coordinated movement. They may not understand the mathematics involved, but their bodies have learned the geometry of survival. The truth of her words was evident in how the townspeople moved through their morning routines. Shop owners maintained clear sightlines. While arranging their wares, children played games that unconsciously taught them about cover and concealment. Even the morning shoppers seemed to naturally position themselves to support each other's movements. But perhaps the most fascinating miscalculation in their equation, Lucy continued, her voice carrying that same deadly elegance, is assuming that I haven't already accomplished my primary objective. Marshal Walker's eyes narrowed. The evidence you gathered, the corruption you uncovered, it's already in motion, isn't it? Lucy's smile was sharp as a razor. Mathematics teaches us that timing is everything. At this very moment, carefully prepared documents are being delivered to selected newspapers, law enforcement offices, and government officials across 3 territories. Each piece containing exactly enough information to demand investigation, but structured so that the full picture only emerges when all the pieces are examined together. Old Jake whistled softly. Like that shooting exhibition you gave last night. Every shot precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect while revealing minimal information about your true capabilities. An apt comparison, Lucy agreed. Though I must say, the mathematical elegance of a well-planned information cascade can be even more satisfying than a perfectly calculated ricochet shot. The morning continued to unfold, but with subtle differences that spoke of permanent change. The townspeople moved with new confidence, understanding at last why they had felt safer these past 8 months. Lucy had done more than just prepare for one night's confrontation. She had transformed an entire community into something stronger, more aware, more capable of defending itself. "You know," Deadeye observed, watching the town's morning activities. "Through new eyes, they'll have to send someone else eventually, someone more dangerous." Lucy's laugh held genuine amusement. "Actually, their tactical options are rather limited now. You see, the fascinating thing about mathematical certainty is how it tends to adjust people's risk calculations. After last night's demonstration, combined with the evidence currently being revealed," she gestured elegantly to the morning sun. "Well, let's just say that the cost-benefit analysis of further action against me has become remarkably unfavorable." The truth of her words was evident in the growing stream of riders visible on the distant mountain trails, the watching gunmen withdrawing to report their failure and face the consequences of their employer's miscalculation. As the morning progressed, Silver Pines settled into its new reality. The quiet mountain town had been transformed into something unique, a community that understood the geometry of survival, taught by a lady who had turned violence into mathematics and protection into an art form. "Will you stay?" Marshal Walker asked finally, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Lucy's smile held both warmth and warning. "For now. After all," she adjusted her apron with precise movements, "someone needs to tend bar, and perhaps teach a few more lessons about the fascinating relationship between mathematics, motion, and the art of staying alive." The Silver Star would continue to serve drinks and welcome travelers, but now everyone understood why it had become the safest saloon in the territory, not just because of the deadly skill of its elegant barmaid, but because she had turned the entire establishment and the town around it into a living demonstration of how geometry, physics, and precise calculation could transform any space into an arena where justice flowed as smoothly as the whiskey. They say some legends are born in blood and gunsmoke, while others are written in the precise angles of mathematics and the elegant geometry of justice. In the years that followed that remarkable night at the Silver Star, Silver Pine became known for more than just its mountain views and rich silver mines. It gained a reputation as a town where trouble seemed to solve itself, where would-be troublemakers found themselves unexpectedly outmaneuvered by seemingly ordinary citizens who moved with unusual tactical awareness. The Silver Star still stands, its weathered walls holding secrets that professional gunmen sometimes travel hundreds of miles to understand. They come to study the mirrors, measure the angles, and try to comprehend how a single shooter had turned an ordinary saloon into a tactical masterpiece that had defeated 14 skilled gunmen without a single fatality. The fascinating thing about mathematics, Lucy would sometimes tell particularly observant visitors, is how it reveals patterns in everything from bullet trajectories to human behavior. She still tends bar with the same fluid grace, each movement a lesson in precision and awareness for those who know what to look for. The town's children grew up understanding concepts that military academies struggled to teach. They learned about angles and trajectories through seemingly innocent games, about tactical positioning through casual suggestions, about awareness through playful exercises that Lucy had carefully designed. Many went on to become renowned lawmen, tactical advisors, and shooting instructors themselves, spreading her lessons across the territories. Marshal Walker kept his own records of the changes that transformed Silver Pine. It wasn't just about the shooting, he would explain to fellow lawmen who came seeking insight. She taught an entire community to think geometrically, to understand space and movement in ways that made conventional tactical advantages meaningless. The corruption Lucy had uncovered did indeed crumble, brought down not by violence, but by the mathematical precision of her evidence distribution. Each piece of information she'd gathered emerged exactly where it would do the most damage, the timing calculated with the same precision she applied to her shooting. Dr. Chen perhaps explained it best. She didn't just teach us to defend ourselves. She showed us how to make defense unnecessary. When an entire town moves with tactical awareness, troubles tend to solve themselves before they begin. The professional gunmen who had survived that night spread their own stories. Tales of impossible shots calculated off multiple surfaces, of tactical preparations so thorough they bordered on prescience, of a lady who could turn mathematics into a more effective weapon than any gun. Dead-Eye Thompson began offering special classes in his gun shop, teaching the principles he'd learned from studying Lucy's methods. "The bullet's path is just geometry in motion," he would tell his students, "but true mastery requires understanding how to shape the space itself." The Silver Star's regular patrons developed their own traditions. They point out the subtle marks in the woodwork, where Lucy's precisely calculated shots had turned the saloon into a geometry lesson written in lead and gun smoke. Some say if you watch carefully on quiet evenings, you can still see her testing new calculations, working out trajectories that seem to defy physics itself. Old Jake, who still runs the saloon, made only one significant change after that night. He added a small chalkboard behind the bar where Lucy sometimes writes out complex mathematical formulae. "For calculating trajectories," she tells curious visitors with that same elegant smile, "both ballistic and life." Young Tommy Martinez did indeed follow in Lucy's footsteps, becoming renowned for his ability to calculate complex shots that seemed impossible to others. He never revealed who had first taught him to see the mathematics in motion, but those who knew would recognize Lucy's influence in his precise movements and careful preparations. The town itself became something of a legend in law enforcement circles, a place where tactical doctrine went to be rewritten. Officers and agents would visit, hoping to understand how a small mountain community had developed such remarkable defensive capabilities. They usually left with more questions than answers, and a newfound respect for the relationship between mathematics and survival. Lucy's methods spread in subtle ways, carried by those she had taught without them realizing they were learning. Other towns began to report similar phenomena. Ordinary citizens who moved with unexpected tactical awareness, communities that seemed mysteriously resistant to troublemakers, saloons where the mirrors seemed arranged with suspicious precision. The true elegance of mathematics, Lucy would sometimes muse while calculating new trajectories in her ever-present notebook, lies not in the complexity of the equations, but in how simple principles, properly applied, can transform everything they touch. They say that on particularly quiet nights, when the mountain wind whispers through the Silver Star's windows, you can still hear the echo of those impossible shots. Each one a testament to how a lady with a mathematical mind and a steady hand had turned an ordinary saloon into a legacy that would reshape the very nature of frontier justice. For in the end, Lucy Blackwood had done more than just demonstrate the deadly poetry of applied mathematics. She had proven that true power lies not in the speed of the draw or the accuracy of the shot, but in the precise calculation of all life's angles and the elegant geometry of preparing for whatever the future might bring. Some say she still serves drinks in that mountain town, each movement a lesson in refined deadliness, each smile carrying the precision of calculated trajectories. And those who know what to look for might notice how the mirrors still gleam with suspicious perfection, how the bottles align with geometric precision, how every angle and shadow seems positioned just so. For in Silver Pine, they understand that some legends aren't written in blood and thunder, but in the precise calculations of a lady who turned mathematics into art, violence into equations, and an ordinary saloon into a testament to the deadly elegance of perfectly applied geometry.